Greetings, I am Sam Aronow, and I don't know if you can hear me, but this is Jewish History on the Plate, and I'm here with...
Rudi Weinberg. I'm a New York City local. Okay, Sam's trying the watercress dumplings.
Layer up some watercress and slice a purple onion very, very thin. That's my James Spader impression. No idea if you can hear it, it's pretty loud in here. Thank you. All right, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm down with that. The texture of the outside is a bit much for me.
I don't know, I like the texture on the outside. Because I've never had that kind of thing before where it's
You
like
and I
the
are
clear...
different people.
That is true. I guess you might have had more of an experience with more Chinese food than me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, New York. I mean, you've got plenty of opportunities. Actually, that's what we're here to talk about.
That is true. There's not that many kosher Chinese places anymore.
It's Christmas.
Yep.
That's when we're definitely filming this.
Yep.
And we're going to take a little walk around, and we're going to learn about the historical origins of the stereotype that Jewish people eat Chinese food at Christmas, which did come up in an earlier video. All right, we're here in Chinatown in New York City. We are on Doyers Street, famously named after the Brooklyn Doyers. And once upon a time, this was the most dangerous street in America because the Chinese men here and the Chinese gangs, the triads, would ambush each other all the time. But now it's all very friendly. And also we're like a block away from the 5 Points, which was like that even earlier. So Chinatown is on the Lower East Side. Of course, this is where a lot of Jewish immigrants lived as well in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this is probably where the tradition of Jews going to Chinese food on Christmas originated.
Well, I know part of it also had to do with the fact that most Christian restaurants were closed on Christmas.
Well, right.
And so Chinese people would keep them open.
That's right. But you have to think about the geography. It just so happens, this is not the case in a lot of American cities, that all of the Chinese neighborhoods in New York in the early 20th century were next to Jewish ones. There were more Jewish neighborhoods, so not all Jewish neighborhoods were in close proximity to Chinese ones, but all the Chinese neighborhoods you had here, you had Sheepshead Bay, and you had Flushing.
So
let me swallow and
it is tofu, right?
all tofu. Meant to be like chicken though.
And they how do they differentiate it?
What do you mean differentiate it from real chicken?
Like they have different kinds of meat substitutes I saw on the menu.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, but tofu, it takes on the flavor of whatever you're using it with. So there must be some sort of chicken substitute that tastes like chicken that they soak it in.
That's just adding steps, isn't it?
Yeah. It tastes pretty good though. It tastes pretty similar to chicken.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have expected that.
All right, we're gonna get into this.
What are you having?
I'm having the curry noodle soup. I think I said that earlier though.
Okay, so we got noodles, we got the broth.
You know what? I had something really similar to this at a really great Taiwanese restaurant in Pasadena.
Oh, wait, so what
This
else
is
do we
really
have
hitting
here,
the
though?
spot.
What else do we have here? So we have this thing over here.
I don't know what that is.
It also looks like tofu of some kind, but I don't know what it's supposed to be flavored as.
Curry flavor?
Probably.
Yeah.
Curry
That's what it
flavor.
is.
We got some other interesting, I mean, some of these are not regular, but like American style vegetables like broccoli, but I wonder if they have any like specifically Asian vegetables in there, like bok choy or something maybe.
My father, yeah, right here. My father
that's
used
bok
to
choy.
grow bok choy. I think he just liked saying bok choy.
It's a fun thing to say.
Okay, so Sam tempted me, so I ordered the same soup. And I have not really had curry before. I generally don't have spicy foods, me being Ashkenazi.
You think this is spicy?
I think it's kind of spicy. I mean, it's
It
got the
didn't
curry in
really.
it.
I mean, it has like a spicy flavor, but it didn't really register to me as something that you could not tolerate. I think it's very mild.
I mean, I can tolerate it. I'm just not used to it. But look, it's making me tear up a little bit.
I'm wondering, because I know that a lot of the Jews formed their neighborhoods in Brooklyn by walking over the Brooklyn Bridge, and I wonder if the Chinese people followed them, and that's how, they still had a budding communities. It would make sense.
They didn't really have a choice. I'm sure you're familiar with redlining.
Yep.
One of the things I had in my possession before my bag was lost in Addis Ababa was a real estate map of my hometown of Pasadena, and it shows basically pre-1968 Civil Rights Act, where you were allowed to sell houses to certain people, not as a matter of law. That had been illegal since 1948, but as a matter of business policy.
De facto versus de jure segregation.
Yes, that's what the 1968 Civil Rights Act was addressing, in contrast to the previous, 57, 64, 65 Civil Rights Acts.
Well, so the Jews and Chinese were, like, I guess, put in similar areas of redlining.
Often, yes. And it's true that this was not just the case in New York. In my video on the melting pot, I talked about New Orleans and how there was basically one neighborhood where new Jewish immigrants, there were older, more wealthy Jews who could live elsewhere. New Jewish immigrants basically lived in around South Rampart Street, which is also where the Italians and the Chinese lived.
That's a big thing here in New York,
like
also.
The Lower East Side.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is the old Jews who'd been here, the old money, who were generally, from the mid-1800s, like the 1860s, they lived on, on the upper areas, like in Upper East Side.
That's
you had
right.
the Gilded Age mansions, not the Vanderbilts, but like, those people up there, versus the new, Eastern European Jews all kind of lived down here and were mostly separate from
That's
their
right. So there
German
were both
counterparts.
ethnic and there were economic segregation. So I think the places where Chinese people were allowed to live generally tended to also be places where Jews were allowed to live. I would guess, based on the traditional hierarchy of prejudice, that there was Jews had more freedom in where they could live than Chinese did. But and in a lot of places, like Los Angeles, the Chinatown was not near the Jewish neighborhood. Yeah, same in San Francisco. They were not bordering. I don't think there was ever a Jewish neighborhood near Chinatown in Chicago. We could go on. Which brings up my point that this really was mostly just a New York thing. I work very hard to showcase important elements of Jewish history that were not in New York City. Because I don't know the degree to which non-Americans are aware of this, but New Yorkers, especially internally, kind of tend to be, at worst, unaware of the rest of the United States and sort of assume that everything is the same everywhere. This is especially true for American Jews, which to a degree makes sense. Like, the American Jewish community is even more heavily concentrated in the New York area.
Well, yeah, this is actually the largest Jewish city in the world, more than Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
In fact, Tel Aviv is not very big.
Well, no, but I meant numbers-wise. Like, we have 1.6 million Jews in this metro area.
New York City is the only city in history to have a Jewish population greater than 1 million.
Like, we make up like 18%, I think, of the population, something like that in this area.
And it used to be more. Like, the Bronx used to be 50% Jewish.
So, I guess that's kind of why there's like a hegemony of people thinking like New York is the Jewish capital, because it is in some ways, but there's definitely other places.
It isn't the majority, and a lot of, especially when I talked about Minhag America, like, yes, New York, like Manhattan alone had like half of the Jewish population in 1840, but all of the important things that were happening in American Jewish history were happening somewhere else. They were happening in the on the West Coast or in the Midwest, in San Francisco or Cincinnati, which I continue to find very interesting. So I feel like I'm trying to combat like New York bias, but because it's so strong in the Jewish sphere, this is kind of reflected in like non-Jewish America, where it's almost stereotyped like all Jews are New Yorkers. Even like in media, even Jews from places that aren't New York will be applied New York elements to them. And it bothers me greatly, because none of my ancestors ever lived in New York. Or the Northeast, for that matter.
So I asked my mom, because they were the ones who were in New York relatively recently, like in 1939, and I asked her, did they have Chinese food on Christmas? She said, no, it's not something they could do. They couldn't afford it. They didn't grow up with as much money because they were refugees, but also it just wasn't something that, was as much of a yucky thing, I guess, like, especially a new immigrant thing. My dad's side of the family, they were the ones who came in like 1900. They would have had it because they lived on the Lower East Side, versus my mom's family came to Washington Heights and then the Upper West Side, so it was less of a thing up there as it was down here.
Fancy.
That said, there is the affinity between Jews and Chinese Americans, especially in New York, it's not just circumstance. like I said, the Chinese Americans were very sympathetic to what was happening to Jews coming from Eastern Europe, specifically the Kishinev pogrom, and that put them in touch with an exiled Chinese revolutionary, because this is before the 1911 revolution, named Joseph Singleton. He was Chinese American. Joseph Singleton was an Anglicization. Now, Joseph Singleton, in addition to being a political radical in China, was also the owner of the Chinese Theater here on Doyer Street, which is now a cocktail bar. So when the Kishinev pogrom happened, Singleton invited the entire Jewish community up to have this big fundraiser, and they raised, like, at the time, $250, which wasn't a lot, like even in 1903, but it was the beginning of a much larger movement, and it really secured that connection at a time when more Jews were coming to New York than ever. So yeah, this was the theater, and it is still the same building. And you would have had people from the very early days of Coalition organizing at this theater. It's a cocktail bar now. It opens in 2 hours. It looked really expensive, but I feel like I have to have a drink in it. We'll see how that goes, maybe in a different video. But that is a rough backstory to why there is a trope of Jews eating Chinese food on Christmas. If you celebrate Christmas, happy Christmas. I'm Sam Arano, and this has been Jewish History on the Road.
And I'm Rudi Weinberg.
Yes, you are. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, Jeffrey Schweitzer, and Ian York.